Very good morning, my dear children. After a long time, we got the chance to continue our class, isn't it? How are you all? Hope with God's grace all are keeping fine. So, for few days, we will recollect what we learned already. Okay? So, in this class, we will revise pollination. Did you remember what do you mean by pollination? Yes, the transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of a flower is called as pollination. And pollination is classified into two types. They are self-pollination and cross-pollination. What do you mean by self-pollination? Yes, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of same flower or another flower born on the same plant is known as self-pollination. What do you mean by cross-pollination? Yes, the cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower on another plant of the same species. It is called as cross-pollination. And self-pollination is classified into three types. They are cleistogamy, homogamy and incomplete dichogamy. And cross-pollination, it's divided into geitonogamy and xenogamy. Okay? Self-pollination is otherwise called as autogamy. Cross-pollination, allogamy. Please don't forget. Okay? Please look at here. This picture, it's very clearly we can see how pollination is taking place, isn't it? It is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of a pistil. It is called as pollination. Self-pollination or autogamy, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to stigma of the same flower. Okay, you can look at the picture, children, and the anthers and stigma should be close to each other. Then only self-pollination is possible. Plants like Viola, Oxalis and Commelinea, they produce two types of flowers. The first type is called as chasmogamous flowers and second type is called as cleistogamous flowers. What do you mean by chasmogamous? Open type, and cleistogamous means closed one. Okay? And again, in chasmogamous flowers, they are similar to flowers of other species with exposed anthers and stigma. That means it is in open condition. And in cleistogamous flowers, they do not open at all. Anthers and stigma lie close to each other and they are autogamous. And when anthers dehisces open in the flower bud, pollen grains come in contact with the stigma for pollination. Then cleistogamous flowers produce assured seed. That means cleistogamous flowers produce seeds in the absence of the pollinators. Okay? You can look at the picture. Chasmogamous and cleistogamous flowers. Okay? In geitonogamy, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. And it is functionally cross-pollination involving a pollinating agent, but it is genetically similar to autogamy since the pollen grains come from the same plant. And in xenogamy, it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of different plant That is why it is called xenogamy. And it brings genetically different pollen grains to the stigma. Okay. Now we will revise the agents which are helping for pollination. Pollination is affected by many agents like wind, water, insect, etc. Isn't it? And on the basis of the agents that bring about pollination, the mode of pollination is divided into abiotic and biotic. What do you mean by abiotic? Non-living. Biotic means living. Okay. Now we will see the characteristic features of abiotic agent, that is wind. And wind is helping for, or it is acting as an agent for pollination. Then they are called as anemophilous flowers. What do you mean by anemophily? Pollination by wind is called anemophily. Wind is more common abiotic agent. Wind pollinated flowers often have a single ovule in each ovary and numerous flowers packed into an inflorescence. Did you remember what you mean by inflorescence? Cluster of florets are called as inflorescence. Okay. Please look at this picture, children. Corn cob. The tassels are the stigma and style which wave in the wind to trap pollen grains. And wind pollination is quite common in grasses. Wind pollinated flowers produce large amount of pollen, and they will be light and non-sticky, and they often possess well exposed stamens, and they will have large stigma, and normally they will be feathery in nature to trap airborne pollen grains. Okay. And again we can pass on to hydrophily, that is pollination by water is called hydrophily. Here water is acting as an agent. So it is quite rare. It is limited to about 30 genera, and mostly they are monocotyledons. Example, you can look at the picture: Vallisneria, Hydrilla and Zoostera. But in lower plants you can see water is a regular mode of transport for the male gametes, and distribution of some bryophytes and pteridophytes is limited because they need water for the transport of male gametes and fertilization. Okay. And you can see in Vallisneria, look at the picture, children. Vallisneria, you can see female flowers reaches the surface of the water by the long stalk, and the male flowers or pollen grains are released onto the surface of water, and they are carried by water currents and reach the female flowers. And in sea grasses, female flowers remain submerged in water, and pollen grains are long and ribbon-like. They are carried inside the water and reach the stigma. Okay. And you can see here the pollen grains of most of the water pollinated species have a mucilaginous covering, that is sticky coverings, to protect from wetting. Not all aquatic plants use hydrophily. In most of aquatic plants, example water hyacinth, that is Acornia, and water lily, etc., the flowers emerge above the level of water for endomophily or anemophily. Did you remember what you mean by endomophily? Insects are helping for pollination. It is called as endomophily. And anemophily, wind is helping as an agent for pollination. Okay. And normally wind and water pollinated flowers are not very colorful, and they do not produce nectar. animals are used as an agents of pollination by majority of flowering plants. For example, bees, butterflies, beetles, etc. And pollination by insect, it is called entomophily. Particularly, bees is more common. Often flowers of animal pollinated plants are specifically adapted for a particular species of animal. The features of entomophilous flowers, that is insect pollinated flowers, are quite large, colorful, fragrant and rich in nectar, and the nectar and pollen grains are the floral rewards for pollination. Okay, and small flowers form inflorescence, that is cluster of florets, to make them visible. Then the flowers pollinated by flies and beetles secrete foul odor to attract these animals. The pollen grains are generally sticky in nature, and when the animal comes in contact with the anthers and stigma, its body get pollen grains. When it comes in contact with the stigma, it results in pollination. And in some plants provide safe places as a floral reward to lay eggs. Just for an example, you can look at the picture, Amorphophilus and Yucca, a moth species, and the plant Yucca cannot complete their life cycle without each other. Already we learned, isn't it? And then many insects consume pollen or nectar without bringing about pollination. They are called pollen nectar robbers. Okay? For today, this is enough, children. We will revise another unit in the next class. Thank you, my dear children.